Hello everyone, let's continue our question and answer series today, reading a message that I got on Schwerpunkt's email that is going to include also the introduction to the question, which is actually about what ifs and the validity of this type of historical inquiry. Say, what's the heuristic value of, say, discussing like possible different outcomes of a specific historical events had it gone in a different way. This is sort of so I've never really made a video explaining why I notoriously disdain what ifs, and this question and answer episode actually provides me with a chance not just of explaining why, but also a counter argument that is obviously like that obvious thing that I agree myself with, by the way, that is to say, in the minimal space within, like what if this battle had been won or lost, what would have been the immediate aftermath, so not really having the capacity of predicting how history would have gone down the line in its entirety. In fact, I'm not going to make what-ifs in the future. Mostly you can ask me about them, of course. I know that they're somehow popular because people are sort of very fascinated mostly with this de facto alternate reality as opposed to concentrate on why things went the way they did, which is very complicated to assess properly in a conventionally objective way. But let's say it would have been likely at some point on Schwerpunkt it would have made at least a couple of points, maybe single video on how can the women imagine history had the Anglo-Danes won at Hastings, right? Or what if Rome had been successfully halted by the Samnitic Confederacy, or this kind of thing. Of course, one can space with a mind. We'll see it later. I'm not going to spoiler the thing. I'm reading again the introduction to the question, which is pretty long. And by the way, I'm always I don't have all the time in the world, but I'm always interested in this. As like not much the personal dimension behind the email, but if anything, the mental approach, like to history, and through, of course, some kind of private information that here I'm allowed to share, even though there isn't really too much about this. So also because this is anonymous, sure, he signs himself. I don't know, like actually this could be a girl, I have no idea. And so, dear Schwerpunkt, I am A, and have been watching your content for over a year, but less than 3, interestingly enough. In the spirit, so you could say whether there were 2 years or not, as a matter of fact. In the spirit of the appeal for further questions and interaction, I'm writing this communication to you. However, if you feel that my question can be answered better by an email response, by directing me to an older video on the channel or the higher quality resources, then I would find that perfectly satisfactory. I would like to thank you for your continuous work in popularizing history, and I'm grateful for your project. Firstly, I shall provide some context about myself, and if you wish to ask any questions yourself about me, then within reason, I would be happy to oblige. I'm in my mid-20s and come from a STEM background. After leaving university, I initially focused on my work and on other intellectual hobbies, but in the past 2 years, I have prioritized my historical learning much more than I had previously. From a very young age, I was fascinated with history, especially military history. As a child, playing with model tanks and aircraft, you are not the only one, or reading about past events, or creating my own medieval armor to wear on Halloween. I did something similar myself. Throughout my secondary education, I chose to take history classes and took them for my final year exam. In my country, the curriculum focuses more on political and social history as opposed to military history. And in hindsight, I feel that this education helped broaden my horizons. I do confess that video games probably played a disproportionate amount of my formation. This is interesting because, at least in my case, in Schwerpunkt's case, that this is my voice here. Of course, that would say not the formation, but let's say the video gaming did reinforce very much like fascination with warfare, plus with military history. But of course, like, it wasn't a specific formation. So it's interesting here that the notion here is that, there is some major basis on that. By the way, STEM, STEM, means science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, for those who don't know. So here we're talking about interesting examples, because I probably would have never been able to study stuff, even though I attended a so-called scientific high school. And possibly that further influenced me as far as warfare was concerned, even though it's not like we talked about that there. But there are, given the what if theme of the question, like interesting implications, like what if I had studied something else? What if I had done something else? So I do, just continuing the question, I do agree with you that they are ultimately a positive force, yes, because I said that video games are, especially for introducing people to new things that they otherwise wouldn't be interested in. Additionally, they also gave me a further glimpse into the military history side of things that I have previously said were neglected during my secondary school education. I still do enjoy Total War, okay, and such for fun, but I have become much more aware of the necessity of using other, more in-depth resources to study a topic compared to how I would think when I was a child. By the way, it's likely that you have already checked out the videos I made on Total War like a few years ago, just like how that works as opposed to reality. And this is connected because there is a lot of determinism in video games, right? Regardless of course, the complexity, especially of titles like those. And so how things sort of get guided towards a specific direction that limits the open space of war, of course, tend to, to give that illusion of how things would actually go if this thing had gone in another way. We'll understand now all the sort of moral and scientific implications of that doubt. Continuing the question, a few weeks ago, I opened up Civilization 3, never played those, to see what the quality of the Civilopedia articles that I read as a 10-year-old were like, and it was like I almost had a minor brain aneurysm when reading the Russian history one. In some ways, I do feel that I might fit into some of the classes of people you denigrate. Yeah, here I haven't really gotten like the Russian reference, but let's say if we're walking, say, along that edge, may be the case. Even if it is on occasion, if it is hyperbolic and for the sake of humor. I share your disdain for the godless and parasitic curse of the communists. Well, that's already something, right? And the perversions of the modern liberals and the painfully low quality of right-wingers, yep, that appear to be gaining traction in recent years. That is really a problem, and I should make more content, especially trying to link Schwerpunkt up with some sort of higher source that could project us to new alternative horizons. Continuing, but in my country, Ireland, okay, so we get, this is important information. There is an incredibly prevalent petit bourgeois mindset amongst our people, and I, despite me definitely holding ideological ideas that are outside the pale here, I do find that some of this petit bourgeois mindset has impacted me subconsciously. Well, because you're probably a third estater, and technically I'm a third estater, even though I have some kind of nobiliar ancestry, but we'll keep this for another video. But in fourth estater, of course, like if we're looking back into it, this is also ever more likely the more you go back in time, in a few generations. Add to that my somewhat half-formed education. I could understand why you may make jests about my background, although for the sake of civility, I would ask that you keep suggests limited to email communications instead of saying them in a video. So yeah, I'm not going to make any, like, I don't even fully track here what's the issue. Because again, I just said it. It's not like I, denigrate anyone just for belonging to a particular background. It depends on what they do, really. The email says, I do consciously reject the perversions of the modernistic, relativistic, egalitarianistic, etc. worldview for all that's worth, but still find traces of my societal milieu leaving an impact on me. Well, it's absolutely fine. If that's your path, again, it's not... It is about at which stage you are, but say if you come from that, it's not like you can change it, you can't make it better, you can't improve, right? That's not what the point of my content, frankly, is. Again, this political realignment is something that started in my teens and in some ways is still occurring. Well, yeah, I mean, if you're in your mid-20s, as you say, that's a path that, especially at that age, starts solidifying towards some, together with your prefrontal cortex, towards something more productive in general. During my university years, I prioritized my studies, but as for my intellectual hobbies, I focused my attention on religious pursuits, having reverted to the Catholic faith following my drifting years as a teenager. I still continue to develop my spiritual life. It was after witnessing the wealth of biblical history that light a spark in me to also return to my love of profane history, quote-unquote profane, which I do view as also intrinsically valuable because it too is written by the same living God, even if it is not quite the same as the sacred word. As for my interactions with the channel, I first discovered it when I was looking for some content about mercenary companies of the Italian wars, which, because I made specifically about the medieval sources of that, because I didn't talk specifically about the condottieri within the framework of the Italian wars, but anyway, so while I understand that you don't consider this topic to be heavily covered by your channel, yeah, in fact, specifically if we're talking the Italian wars, like in the Renaissance, that's sort of, actually I've never covered that yet, in any case, but I talk about mercenarism on a broader European scale, about also, of course, talking about the condottieri. We made videos about the Landsknecht, and if you're talking also about just, in fact, foreigners that fought in the peninsula at that time. In any case, while I understand that you don't consider the topic to be heavily covered by your channel, nevertheless, it was my gateway to your work. Fine. You wonder why people listen to your long videos. In my case, I'll just let you know that when we are working the lonely 12-hour night shift multiple times a week, you have a lot of spare time to listen to YouTube videos. I do curate the videos of yours that I watch and chiefly focus on topics that I'm familiar or semi-familiar with, looking through old playlists to find such videos. However, I do understand that in the spirit of the channel, you desire to promote a universal and eclectic vision, and as a result, I do mix in a few of the more obscure videos into my feed, although I will not waste my time watching something which I consider to be too far beyond my fields of interest. Like I've said before, I'm not particularly long-term viewer and am still in the process of gaining insights into the full scope of the Schwerpunkt project. So at the moment, I prioritize political and military history as a hobby, with religious, social, and economic being on my radar too, but less heavily covered. I do feel much of my dead time at work or driving with YouTube or podcast style work, but have returned to regularly reading history books and biographies. Reading articles and papers is something that I have done, but not as much. Therefore, I'd like to ask a mini question that is, how should I structure my learning so that I can develop as an amateur historian? So I actually made some videos explaining this. If you go in the East Terrain playlist, you will find, especially around, let's say, 2020, 2021, and also later before, but mostly in those years, multiple videos on how to write this and how to write that. There is my PhD Tales series. There is literally how to write an article, how to write a thesis, or something less academic, as you're asking, like where I should start from. I made recent videos on that, like giving lists about books that I recommend to start, say, medieval history, or what there are literally multiple people already that I already answered to in question and answer videos regarding that, right? Literally, where do I start as a without university education in history to learn history at a serious level? Can I do that? All that kind of stuff. So of course it's a big topic and I can't simply answer this, given that I especially made those videos already. Now I don't have all the time to cover everything, but you'll find very, very precise content dealing with that. And again, historian playlist, just scroll down, you'll find surely also other interesting things in the process. Continuing with the question, I don't think that I will be returning to university to become a professional historian, but I would appreciate guidance in the form of perhaps a textbook recommendation or such so that I can grow intellectually. So yes, I think a year ago or something I gave you, probably a list of the advice reads that can open gates to as I often say, close-blitzingly speaking, it's not much what kind of book you use, but if you are just willing to look at the bibliography and say, okay, I'll pick these other books, I want to learn ever better this topic, etc., you may end up becoming even publishing. Like at this online, it's full of people. I've been interviewed, for example, by Veritas and Caritas. In most of the sort of Anglo-American examples there that I've been watching on the channel just before the interview were about literally not even historians, amateur historians, in fact, that publish very niche topics, very fairly interesting things, like to tell it all. But that, of course, like it's also a bit of a different. It depends on really what you want to do with history at that point, rather than others. So it's mostly deciding what you want to do with that, right? And of course, I actually always advise to follow a university track. Of course, like in your mid-20s, I realize you would have not liked to start with another path. You don't have the time, the inclination. It's totally fine. But I was wondering about this before I studied history myself, because I said, oh my God, I love history so much, but now on a different track. I studied myself economics for like 6 months. I tried medicine as well in the Navy, and I was thinking, oh damn, but I love history. What do I do? How do I learn? That after I started doing something else, right? And so it's actually more interesting for me to see how you can succeed. Like I wonder, for example, whether the people I answered were, what they're doing. Like my idea in general is that probably that they haven't gone through with that. Like that's maybe a youthful wish, and then you start making more money, you start getting to things, family, work at higher levels. Let's say it's not going to be on your forefront. Let's say what kind of history book you want to read, or how you become an amateur historian on some level. Like, but it would be interesting because I do have people who watched my channel and eventually they started learning history, and they were also not particularly young people anymore, and that's always interesting. But that's what I say to people, like if you have the chance, like for some weird sort of availability in life to take a degree, make a doctorate or whatever, go for it. I think it's quite interesting. It can really open different avenues. It really changes your mind. It's not even just having the title or anything, but having gone through the process. And of course that requires greater commitment. So as you said, you're not at least seeing yourself into that. I'm not going to comment on further. So into proper historical methods. Furthermore, I'd be interested in seeing how the field is understood from a continental standpoint. This would be good food for thought for sort of different answers, so a different question and answer video. And by the way, to all the people that already answered, that send me these letters, it happened, or so if you send sort of elaborated texts that explain in depth what you want to know, so you can't send multiple ones, then of course the more they arrive at the less I'm going to pick eventually in relative terms, but it's a strategy to some degree. Just of a, last months we've done something like in tandem, like with a guy asking me like 3 letters in a row about the same topic, and I made it public. It was even relatively successful. Sometimes the topic may be even wild, something strange, never heard. For example, that question about Serbia I think it was the last Q&A episode, was really intriguing, and it made lots of views unexpectedly. In any case, can I answer about the continental standpoint in this video? It's a bit difficult. There isn't really such. We can watch. Well, okay, I don't even talk about that. I've never really made a video about that. I made a video, if anything, about the Anglo-American side of the story and what are certain issues, because that emerged from a Q&A as well, and it was mostly descriptive of the Anglo-American thing, but still in opposition, or say in comparison to the continental one. And there isn't really a formal standpoint. Like, people hear this, they start thinking, oh my god, continental, this is sophisticated, maybe there are schools, there's higher level. But actually, we live in a time in history in which we don't have sort of that specific current highlighted by a specific school that just looks at within itself, etc. It's going to be mostly like what kind of things happen to a certain degree in this or this other field, and why, than anything. And so, of course, I have a specific method, but at this point, especially for YouTube, of course, I have my own method, also academically speaking, but the way and the things I discuss here just follow the experience of my YouTube practice, and of course, on top of what I learn on my own, and mixed all together, because this is fairly unique. So I can say that there's a Schwerpunkt way to things that is strikingly ever more distant from most scholarship in some ways, and I think for the better, not in the sense that I'm particularly critical of the legitimacy of scholarship. I don't think there is a substitute to that, but say, of course, I'm heavily critical of certain scholarly approaches because I think that they're mostly lazy blips. In any case, continuing the question, much of the content I consume is produced by British historians. Your Irish blood is suffering because of that. We're usually quite competent, but do have their shortcomings. Yeah, it depends. If you're talking content here in general, of course, books, fine, absolutely. There is a great legacy there. And I am myself very Anglo-American in sort of literary information, not educationally speaking, not by institution, but still by also the type of things that I formed myself on. It says, regarding the shortcomings, such as oftentimes getting basic history blatantly wrong. When discussing Ireland, that's how you see that was kind of obvious as a pet peeve of mine, right? Yeah, I hope you know that I have a especially medieval Irish history playlist. So if you're interested in that, it's always a pleasure. It's also about Gaelic warfare, ancient Ireland to a degree. So if you decide to include my question in a video, you can exclude as much of this context as you wish and only provide enough that you feel is relevant for viewers. I had read, of course, this before I made the video. Of course, I wanted to integrate it. Understand that I have been quite wordy, but this is so that you can see where I'm coming from, perhaps with a few embellishments, so as to humanize myself, so that I'm not a mere faceless user tag on the internet. I wanted to crack bad jokes here, but you asked me not to do so. So you didn't give me it was just a bad joke from medieval stereotyping about, British archipelago's warfare, etc. But in any case, I do apologize if it is too much, and would like to thank you for reading this email of mine. Of course, you're welcome. I found it very interesting, and again, it's an important source of information, because in order to answer the question, if you set the tone and offer some information to me, it's easier to really address the question in a not necessarily a customized way, because this is also for everybody, but in a way that is more effective for everyone involved, in fact. So my actual question is as follows. What is the value of counterfactuals and how we go about creating fruitful counterfactual scenarios that will result in a greater understanding of reality? So in other words, are what is valid and how and what. All right, so I have seen varying opinions. So I'm keeping, of course, to read the text. I've seen varying opinions from professional historians on this issue. On the one hand, I do see the fruitlessness of spending large amount of time on extravagant what-if alternative history scenarios. I've come to view them as a kind of intellectual junk food, something to indulge in on occasion for fun and banter amongst friends. but not something that you should rely upon for sustenance. Questions such as what if the Roman Empire had an industrial revolution are simply too massive and quickly devolve into fiction, which is its own separate field with its own merits. Again, junk food can be fun to eat on occasion, but our inferior means to furthering our knowledge of humanity's past. Yes, and I could open a parenthesis about the Industrial Revolution, the Roman Empire. At least, let's say, I'm sure, again, that we can profitably criticize any YouTube video that discussed this to some extent, as it's plausible that maybe some video framed the question in a correct way and gave a straightforward answer. That is to say, yeah, here we have to understand why this is the prodrome to the question, to the pulp of it, because it's like, when is that everything in theory is possible, right? History can't go different directions, but the question is still historical here. That is to say, not much what if the Roman Empire had an industrial revolution, but in that sense, even if we want to set the premises of that happening and say to which degree, what does it mean to have an industrial revolution, really? Because even technologically, from somebody, especially with your background, speaking of the author, like, you can understand it, it's just like may mean many different things at once. So mostly the way Schwerpunkt would turn that into is why the Roman Empire did not have an industrial revolution, which is, in that sense, fruitful in the sense that it doesn't indulge into fantasy, but it explains the factual knowledge of why the Romans wouldn't go into an industrial revolution. And it seems to me that the internet abuses of that, because it's sort of cool in a way, to like a steampunk, like alternate scenario, whatever. But to some people, at least, I say never really liked that genre, so to say. But at least I understand the appeal, right, to the masses, etc. It's mostly like, okay, in 15 minutes you cannot even set the premises to make a person think this topic in any serious way. So of course I agree, basically. And if I remember, because I read this email some time ago, as the letter continues, I basically agree with most of what is said. Like, I don't have any, I'm just explaining why that is the case. And in fact, the message continues, says, however, we're not historic determinists. Yes, the course of human events has been predetermined by the divine, but each human actor's free will is impactful. There is no contradiction between predeterminism and free will, absolutely. And yeah, welcome, let's say, not in your case, but to whoever is listening is not there, welcome to Catholicism. And since we acknowledge that the choices that people make do matter and do impact history, shouldn't we take that into account instead of treating history as something unchangeable and impersonal? Yeah. So I understand this is a rhetorical question, but of course there could be some interesting reflections on this as well, meaning mostly how and why do we conceive history? Like, what kind of role do we attribute to individual action as opposed to bigger events, certain dynamics? In my opinion, it's there is actually a very deep connection between individual action and the general course of events, not banally in the sense, especially about the individuals in charge, but also in an Hegelian way is the sum of that, like in the traditional, like there is a leader and the others have supported them. And that's actually the point. From a Clausewitzian standpoint, every action is political to a degree, and everything is enshrined in this fuses, in this synergy of, you could imagine the Trinity operating like it. So everything that happens for a very specific act of will, as much as understanding the wall, right? Something amazing about civilization is the fact that even though so many things are unforeseen, there is a general control on it, right? So that moments of crisis especially show you that there is some sort of laxity in the way we, generally speaking, set things on almost autopilot that actually does not speak of much of recklessness, as it can be understood as such as well. But if anything of some, okay, like we got this, like after all, the world we often think, especially from an individual standpoint, oh my God, I don't know anything about the world if I really think about it's a wall, etc. But at the same time, there is a very specific gateway, humanly wise, to a higher level understanding of how the world is going and how and why. And it doesn't seem to be, you see, if this was not really predictable, let's say bigger things were just out of our control in a general sense, say civilizationally speaking, historically speaking, politically speaking, everything would go constantly, nothing would make sense, prevalently speaking, if not what we individually do. And instead, I don't think that any sort of approximation about history in a broader, let's say, political, historical, cultural fashion is basically just a gross misunderstanding. It's just picking one random factor and not analyzing the whole picture. There is always some sense that there are other things that make sense outside. Of course, there are people who dump things down. Like, exactly, we're not historic determinists or materialists or relativists or whatever. But in this sense, we also understand that it's fairly easy to understand where the world is going, given that there is a personal force that we are in human agency. Think about world international relations, like general historical trends. The more you study history, the more you realize how directly integrated this whole thing is, for us at least to have adapted to it, apparently, in a way that things do make sense. So I'm definitely not a reductionist, but say fairly positive about the fact that people can understand what the world is. And if anything, most of the ideas that we have about it and debate exists about it is mostly like a debate between dummies that haven't done their homework, rather than some deeper philosophical problem. Whether we can understand something, how it, and why it happens, or whatever. Whether we can make a history of the 20th century or something like that. Now, going on with the question. Firstly, by examining the choices that people made and contemplating their alternatives, we can further understand the gravity of the choices that they made. For example, I was distracted. I was thinking about something else today. By examining the choices that people made and contemplating their alternatives, okay, we can further understand the gravity of the choices that they made. Sure. For example, if we ask, quote, what if the Gribeval system were flawlessly implemented, or what if the Gribeval system was completely rejected in the 18th century? And this is because I made a video about that sometime recently. What impact would this have on the Napoleonic Wars? Before answering the question, let's go on a bit. By contemplating this scenario, can we gain a better understanding of just how unimpactful the system was for French artillery? Well, let's say we know what the Gribeval system worked like. So let's say the question here, what if had Gribeval system simply immediately introduced without that back and forth that we explained in that video, because there were essentially two factions within the system, Lavalier and Gribeval, that were politically struggling over this reform or not, etc. So for Gribeval won, but it wasn't like everything was fully kicked in. There were some sort of tail strikes from Valier's party that sort of lengthened a bit at times, right? Also, in this sense, Gribeval system, what if the Gribeval system had not been introduced, right? And which impact would this have on Napoleonic Wars? Well, we don't even know exactly whether there would have been Napoleonic Wars without the Gribeval system, meaning that all the, say, for example, leadership, say, changes in that context, certain political, military decisions would have significantly altered the course of French history and world history to a degree that even if, I don't know, the revolution had existed in the same way, the American Revolution had developed in the same fashion, it would have been something substantially different. And maybe, regardless, for example, a very good French doctrine of employment that parallels, of course, like a civilization in that sense, we may have not even been presented with the instances where this artillery would have been so clamorous, like it was in the hands of Napoleon, that in turn had been a product of the Gribeauval system, interestingly enough. There would have not been Napoleon without the Gribeauval system, but also, say, without Napoleon, the Gribeauval system would have not been employed in the way that we know at that level, just because the man did things that were outstanding in his own regard. So going back to the question, by contemplating these scenarios, I guess, can we gain a better understanding of just how impactful, unimpactful the system was for French artillery? In my opinion, no. Right? I don't want to sound banal or whatever, but let's say if you, the only way to answer this question is to actually study what happened. Because if you start making what ifs, first of all, you literally lack, as we've seen, the actual backdrop were to make everything rest, standing on its legs, right? But the reason at the root of this is that the only kind of source that we have in order to make that reflection is actually how things went historically. So again, if you take away one piece at the very beginning, like the Gribeauval reform was before the Napoleonic era, like what's the point of talking with the Napoleonic Wars? Right? It would have not existed, say, we would have not even been talking about the Napoleonic Wars, right? So the question continues, it says, in this way, we're not asking the question for the sake of asking the question, but rather the counterfactual is serving as a handmaiden that serves us in studying the real events. In effect, we are actually asking the question, how impactful was the Gribeauval system? And the counterfactuals are in service of this, right? And this is actually slightly different from what you wrote, because you gave here two different scenarios that are not actually, in fact, I was just gonna say, this would have worked much better if you had simply said, how impactful was the Gribeauval system? So can we understand without that in the immediacy of, let's say, starting from the moment in which this was implemented, looking at what if this had not been implemented, how would have things continued? The answer is also probably not well for the French. And that's also the reason why the Gribeauval system came about and succeeded, and the times were mature for that, regardless of this backlash. So again, if the two questions are, let's say, what, in fact, this had been flawlessly implemented, or say, had this been completely rejected, fine, okay, but the thing on the Napoleonic Wars adds a layer of unpredictability that at that point doesn't make more sense than, in fact, starting to think about an alternate scenario that is so vast, like the one essentially triggered by French politics, military, and society, given that this was intertwined with the one of the World War, and so something that just by definition you couldn't calculate in the moment. Besides, what kind of there could have been, let's assume there was a pivotal factor, that a strict decisional point in time or in the process that would have basically shifted the odds entirely in the moment. Still, what kind of evidence do we have about such a large of a system that is global, basically, in nature, for changing ways that, how would that help, really? You can, of course, refine this down to things like, okay, but still, basically, 18th, 19th century armies at that point would have kept evolving along the same technological patterns, more or less, right? We were surely taking different detour for similar things that eventually went down in history. Kind of. Of course, the more you distance yourself from that point in time, the more bizarre things can go. But let's say in the moment, it's unlikely that, things would have dramatically changed in the art of war just per se. But again, how much do we have refined this before arriving to the point that it's just, what if it actually happened as it did, as the only way to actually go with this? Or even just starting from how it did. Again, we study the Gribeauval system exactly because it happened. It was successfully implemented, and it was a hell of a system. Otherwise, you wouldn't even pose the question, likely. So the point remains that point. Let's see how you develop this, because I forgot before reading the... So continuing... So I see again the counterfactual, just to conclude, because it was the last bit of the paragraph. I can't see how useful would it be to study the counterfactuals since all the factuals are something that is also particularly complex to study and to research. Say, even in what we actually know, to make you understand how complex the thing actually is, in reality, the way it happened. It's not like, say, we know that the Gribeauval system was issued, that the reform was successful, that the French had like a hell of an army at that point, and things really changed world history, including, again, the aforementioned American War of Independence, etc. However, it's not like we have, in the moment, like any mean to simply picture this event as so basically, like the Gribeauval system was enacted, all right, was introduced, like the French military doctrine was effectively changed at that point. Like a univocal way to read this, right? Because if you picked, say, even all the top experts on the Gribeauval system existing today or ever exist, and you read their work, or even assuming that they all studied from the same text, let's in fact create a what if, in a sense, or a potential, let's say, all these people would interpret the thing in different ways. So the question is, on which basis are we actually resting there? Because it seems to me that even the degree by which those people would see the difference would be too narrow to actually have any kind of absolute depiction. Of course, we cannot know everything of how the system really worked. Right? It takes really a lot to understand how a system worked. Yes, you can look at certain battles and look and say, oh, this French use of artillery was very effective in this battle. Definitely, like if you compare the Valdière system, like if the French had not had that type of firepower, things would have gone differently again. But where does this rest, right? It's, in which war, in which battle? Because, again, history would have gone completely differently. And so also other people's armies would have had sort of different changes at that point accordingly. As we know that the Gribeauval system had on other countries. We also talked about that in that video. So, yet again, we're actually not doing or saying too much regarding what these counterfactuals would really help in the scenario. So going on, furthermore, the historical figures themselves had to wrestle with some pretty important what-if scenarios. Every time they make a decision, they have to weigh in their mind whether they are making the right call and what are the consequences if they fail. This is a very important point. I like very much this part of the question because there is literally a passage in the Von Krieg in which von Clausewitz states that indeed also these hypothetical scenarios actually own a strategic weight, because it's literally, as the question here points out, of course, the basis of plans. Like we act because we experimented in everyday life. Of course, like more or less an idea that regardless of adversities and the unpredictability, we can say, I don't know, picking my carafe here and drink the water inside, right? But the way, for example, we would grab the carafe or how much we would actually drink, this is still in the realm of approximation, of convention. So absolutely, there is something in that, and it's a very important strategical element in the story. Going on with the question, to take another example covered on the channel by almost a year ago, but I know you're proud of this miniseries, that being, what if the Allied armies landed in Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy? Right? I'm glad you watched that video about Overlord and the Battle of Normandy. Absolutely, that is a very good example, because if anything, if I remember correctly what I said in that video regarding the what if, because of course I brought it up, and why did I bring up, etc. It's like the tide, right? If things had gone slightly different, a few centimeters of water depth more or less would have changed the outcome of the entire operation. Of course, this was also partly calculated, but that's not quite the point per se. That's just something, in fact, that as all the factors weight and could not really be even properly controlled. I mean, this was just one minimal thing, but it's not like in the moment Overlord was being enacted, that was the only thing that the planners were thinking about, right? It was more like the wall, and so many other factors that, as we've seen also recently in the video about the Pointe du Hoc, like what if the Pointe du Hoc battle had failed? Like what would have occurred on Utah, on Omaha? And we know, and we've seen it, in fact, in that miniseries about Overlord, that literally a failure in any major beach sector would have likely brought to the collapse of the entire beachhead, and the Allied invasion would have failed, right? But in this sense, every time we make this consideration, we narrow it down to a specific case, right? We can see how, of course, for example, not just the operation succeeded, and so obviously there was something at the root, including that strategic what if made in the planning and in the organization, in the enactment, that still got it right at some greater level that seems also more morally, constitutive, and that, in fact, is quite difficult to measure because it does seem to be, in fact, the so-called decisive side of the story. Remember that von Clausewitz, in this sense, is the same guy who tells you that, yes, there are all these things that have a strategic weight, but war is still a struggle between moral forces that influence one another reciprocally. In fact, there are the various laws of reciprocity in the von Kriege that are all illustrated, so that at the end of the day, that what if, in the same Clausewitzian theory, is just, let's notice that this thing actually is a strategic quantity, but why? Right? Because it's not merely a descriptive issue, but remember that von Clausewitz is providing us with a manual, is providing us with something that really it has to be useful for the commander on the field, is making us read not just in our own mind, to clarify it more importantly, but also in the one of the enemy, meaning if you pose a certain threat, because you, for example, make a feint or whatever, like you prospect the possibility of something to happen, you're basically, and this has all specific strategic consequences also in practice, because you have to enact that ruse. You're playing with your enemy's minds, and which is what exactly happens in war at every moment. And so it's more like a mean to an end for von Clausewitz to teach us essentially how we work, so that we can understand how people also work in war. And look, that there is this thing you can exploit in many different ways, and consider that you're also being influenced in turn by this ghosts, right? This kind of Kantian ideas, and that's quite a relevant aspect of the war. Right, but we also describe all the time how there is hardly anything decisive that is properly not even important to calculate. In fact, that's what von Clausewitz basically says. Like, you must reason morally, because if you start pretending to make the maths of moral forces, you're not going to get anywhere. Right, you will get down to materialistic analysis that does not exist, because war is not a deterministic system. Reality is not a deterministic system, and so at that point you will tend, in order to justify the idea, to narrow it down to some predisposed factor that you're also going to isolate from the bunch, where there are, again, so many different factors, and not even one comes close to be a 50% plus one. So what would properly make it the decisive one? Because von Clausewitz mostly uses the term decisive to say it's the conclusive thing on top of many others, so you can saying, okay, this was actually what decided it, because it was the last, but it doesn't take in that there isn't really something in between. You can easily, even when everything is over, when historians have researched this, like, you can't say, okay, it's just this factor, even a bunch of major factors. You can't say, okay, it makes any sense to think that this was how and why something would go like somewhere or not. Let's continue the question though, because this says the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht dedicated serious mental effort towards answering this hypothetical scenario. And if we are to really study what happened during Overlord, shouldn't we also try to get inside the heads of the people who were involved? Sure. In fact, that's exactly what we do in war. And this is true for every kind of interaction. Like, I'm trying to get into your head right now to sort out where we're getting with this. Like, so how that plays and how I can assault that, so to say. So try to ask the same questions that Eisenhower and Rommel were asking themselves, because their answers to this question impacted their troop placement, disproofing operations, and so on. Yeah, and this is interesting because you will never know that, right? You can't see what Eisenhower did. Of course, there can be very informed biographies that to an extent will tell us how these people thought, and we can get the gist of that, etc. But it's like we don't have like the mental activity of Eisenhower and Rommel like put to pay on paper like throughout the whole invasion, critical moments during the same or the planning operation. Like of the operations, we know a lot, but in their same estimation, of course, what would have happened was something relatively unpredictable. I mean, military men really know this to an important degree. Of course, they can have very different ideas. And we partly, in fact, discussed this in that mini-series. But in that sense, the military leaves, and von Clausewitz explains this properly, of the second person of the wonderful trinity, that is gambling. All right, you cannot be a military man if you don't have that taste of, I really want to see what happens when I roll the dice and how I can handle the situation in the midst of that. All right. It's a incredibly risky game. But that's exactly why the military is needed, because the military is also going to correct that, right? This is not merely, in fact, dice rolling, like in the example, but again, setting this and knowing that any plan is going to be modified as soon as things begin. In the way through, etc. And von Clausewitz also tells us how to be at the helm of the operation, so to say, in terms of when things reach a critical point. What do? We are under the greatest pressure. Do we give up or do we come back? The limit between like a mitigated disaster and sort of pulling out in time, provided that this of course is like a broader failure in that case, is actually also potentially the one that between pulling back, losing the opportunity of scoring a great victory and probably breaking enemy resistance at that point. And this is in many ways also how Overlord went down. And so the military is not mostly a predispositive thing, right? It's the combat. It's the element, the dynamic element of it. Also in a hierarchy, according to the classical principles of warfare that allow you to literally operate in the fight in ways that you must be there to determine exactly because they are unpredictable. And again, the series on the Falkrieg explains this pretty well. Von Clausewitz does it much better than I can. And it tells you in that sense especially why, because this is also a pillar of Clausewitzian philosophy, like you cannot know this, right? And not just, it's not like you cannot predict things correctly. Properly to that tiny limit is going to make the difference between victory and defeat. Otherwise, wars would never be fought, right? But you cannot predict it because that's not even the point. You're there to fight. So if you are going to externate from that dimension of combat and basically presume that it's just something that was doomed since the beginning, they're going to be wrong. For example, that also series I made about the Kaiserschlacht, I think, is quite sort of educational in many ways, essentially, because it shows how it's not like, especially in major engagements, there is some terribly bad idea that nobody had ever seen, and even had seen or understood before things started. As many people would like to think that was the case. This thing was doomed since the beginning. And this goes both ways all the time, right? And when you actually study the combat, how they fought this thing through, you realize how close they went to change the scenario so many times, multiple times, and if you are exposed to military history, to the art of war, say either as an actual commander or as a military historian, enough times, you do know that the entire point of the combat is this kind of game that is happening, that, as von Clausewitz defines, is both objective and subjective, because it's not just like you're in charge of it, but it's going to affect the entire reality of the story. And so this is incredibly difficult to say. This is the trap of what ifs, that they drag you down to that kind of deterministic, materialistic, seductive scenario where say, oh, you can't determine just this was the thing that made it and trash all the rest, so less work. It never works like that. And we don't have the means to control this. Also, in the age of AI, we presume that there is some deterministic answer we can give to things just because the machine will sort of think that. This is the eternal illusion, technologism, in warfare especially. And I could open so many scenarios, actually, and this is also the proof that the Clausewitzian theory is always more alive and relatable than corrected than ever. Like, there was never a time which we could do without von Clausewitz really to understand what war is and how it is fought, and including how you can make this kind of immediate assessments. Like, okay, now I want to go there and do this thing, and then you do it, and it's maybe you succeed. So you successfully predicted what would happen, but not in the sense that you understood exactly what would happen in between. And is it important? Von Clausewitz says, nah, not much, really. Even determining at the end of the battle what is that determined that. This said by a Prussian general that literally, was, in between some of the greatest war in the history of mankind up to that point, that played important role in the Waterloo campaign, and had really seen it all in many ways in it. And there are beautiful pages describing properly the effect of war. Trash Keegan, right? And its horrifyingly culturalistic scenarios. Look at what von Clausewitz tells. And that's the dimension, but this is the guy that would tell you how it actually is, and he's not really even thinking for a moment that it's even important to determine what was the factor that would allow you in that sense to predict things, because that's not how it happens when you are into it. And when you are into it, you have to work very, 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 very hard in order to make things go your way. And still you're into chaos, apparently, and you're under the greatest pressures ever. And this is the beauty of war. Like, I would have never studied war if it wasn't so beautiful in this. Because what's more beautiful than fighting against any odd into chaos and tragically acquainting yourself with the truth and making mass cults and basically struggling with it. It's something you understand why the ancients believed that holy war was the gateway to heaven, why holy war was really a thing, and it's real. It's purely morally and scientifically correct. So the last paragraph at least of the question. In the case of Overlord, it is rather simple. We know that the military commanders contemplated this question because of the large amount, because here the entire issue is, what if the Allied armies landed in the Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy, right? So that's an interesting side of the story, but we will describe this similarly to what we did with the Grubeval system. So since this is what the guy is asking, we know that the military commanders contemplated this question because of the large amount of documentary evidence, right? And specifically the fact, of course, that Pas-de-Calais was not just the most fortified section of the Atlantic Wall, but of course presented with obvious advantages from one side that had been countered by the Axis. And so, in fact, as we explained, notoriously, the idea that Normandy would have been a better place, like had been in the mind, by the way, of much more, in the sense, strategically muscle-minded, so to say, individuals that would view war in ways that the normal, the common mortal, especially the one who has not had a relentless military practice in positions of higher command would think. Naturally, I also have something on Rommel that I will make perhaps this summer, I don't know, that will, in that sense, also point to the shortcomings, to the limits of the mind. Because, again, speaking of the mind, where this what if dwells, of course, there are so many factors themselves in terms of, like, we think that, again, a huge mind, a great mind, a very successful person is just per se like an enormous mind. Not really, right? Meaning that the mind is pretty big already by itself. It's just more like the way it's shaped and functionalized for something. And of course, how adaptive in certain circumstances it can be, etc. But it's not like these ideas stemmed from overthinking, you know? And we know here, for example, like, it's very notorious that war games were carried out as possible simulations, right, of what could and would happen. And again, I will not digress on that because I already made a video about Kriegsspiele, as also the passage of The Longest Day, where in the movie, like, probably this aspect of Normandy, of Pas-de-Calais was actually discussed, is not actually how, like, even just the basics of the military understanding of in the minds of these commanders would have really gone, really. And even about between Normandy and Pas-de-Calais, there isn't this enormous difference. Like, I mean, let's be honest here. Von Clausewitz tells very clearly that war, especially the bigger we think, it's actually simpler than it seems. Right? The problem with war is not the fact that it's overly complicated. It must not be, even just for operational reasons. But it's hard. So, of course, there were overwhelmingly complicated calculations or attempts to assess all the possible factors that here were playing, and many things happened at the last minute, as we know. That was Eisenhower's decision, or that was Eisenhower's call, and we've seen with which, that from a moral point of view, with kind of determination, but also ease, he said, let's go. Because it's not much even just the choice of these scenarios. Of course, that at the time was not on the way anymore, meaning that they were not going for Pas-de-Calais, but let's say before, like when this was chosen, who knows what could have happened in different scenarios. Right, there are different avenues to different, but because we also tend to reason as if, if you make the wrong, that's the greatest mistake in many ways that we make. Like, if we took this other path, we would have surely failed. No. All right, if that path had already been outlined as a viable way, there are enough reasons for having some odds, surely higher, lower than others, but still, you would have had to fight it through in order to know that, right? In fact, that's the entire problem of planning a strategy, that you do not know what is going to happen, right? So it's not much about the positive choice that does exist, and there is a clarity of vision that especially the military genius has, as von Clausewitz beautifully describes, also from a psychological point of view. But it's also just something that you have to work in a way. Like, the greatest expectation here was not really whether that choice would have been in the moment, the right one or not, just by decision, but how this would have been played out. Because you know how we've seen it recently in the video about the Pont du Hoc, how you already know by default that so many things are going to go wrong, right? And quite a few things will go in the worst possible way. But this is true also for the enemy. And so, what ifs tend a bit to reason like playing against a wall of some sort, while war is, by definition, not that. And of course, trying to see how different, if we want to track this mental path of the decision making, etc., like how, for example, I don't know, these various, like, Rundstedt's decisions conflict, even within the same, with Rommel notoriously, for example, and rather than specifically even with the Allied command, and how all these factors interplayed. Can we fully track that? it's not much the fact that we fully can't, we can't, kind of can in more superficial ways, but the point that we should always make is, heuristically speaking, is it valid? Like, meaning, can we spend this actual information when we find it? Or are we mostly to actually learn something in moral terms? This is something which I actually struggled myself with. I mean, I didn't struggle for it, but let's say I struggled to explain in the most effective way possible. That is, for example, the story of citations of history. As if history could be reduced to a bunch of scholarly references, and you couldn't have like a very sort of fluid, plastic, concrete idea of how history went, because you have since it's so complex, as we were saying before about the Grubeville system, every expert will still have a different idea of it. And so how do you calculate at that point what it is? History is not a matter of citations. History is a matter of authority, right? The mind has the greater power in this sense. And of course, it has to make sense. It has to align with reality. So it's not like you don't have to make the work on it. But that's also what people skip. Just like they skip the combat element when they make strategic analysis. They skip the work that it took to get there. The things that this historian knew to get there. And to some extent, you will never know. For example, when you really publish good stuff, like you research a lot a certain topic, and you obviously look at scholarship, and you enter the mind of this author or researcher that got into this. And first of all, like, you have the chance of measuring yourself with a person that initially surely knows much more than you, until you look at their work about their own. But even when you actually get that person, it's not like you fully ever know what kind of sort of mental, what background factor predisposed that person, for example, in explaining history in a way or another. That's why there isn't a history book that is equal to another, authorially wise, or even just within the same author. I mean, the way you explain a certain topic is always going to change. It's always going to differ. And you can hardly do anything about it, right? This is, in my opinion, extremely important to underline. So going on with the question, but almost every major decision that people ever made was contemplated by themselves, at least to some degree. We don't have the same amount of evidence as to why Caesar made every decision during his Gallic campaign. Can we try to ask counterfactual questions to study his decision-making process further? Okay, but further where? Like, Caesar is a good example because, he's such a logical guy. He was such a talented author, and as we outlined in a recent video, like, he literally provides you with a counter-insurgency manual and making sense all across the board, also for the people who think that for some reason, it's propaganda, because they literally are not intelligent enough to understand what that work is about and what it actually says, quite concretely speaking. If you don't pass through that, you don't get... There is always an actual explanation, I mean, to an end. We don't know what happened in Gaul other than what Caesar wrote in practice. Archaeological finds are not that useful, frankly, to reconstruct the stuff. And in that way, what amazes you about history is how actually coherent, logical, and accurate and plausible, even if you assume this was complete fantasy, this all is. I mean, whoever wrote this, I mean, we know that Caesar wrote it, but let's say whoever this was, and say we're talking about an abstract reality, let's imagine you have never read it and it follows the same logic, whatever. Just by reading what is written, you know that this person was a military commander, and a quite talented one, to say the least. All right, had seen it all before, and is actually describing real events in very acutely precise ways. And this is not much a matter of opinion. Right? This is why we study Caesar. It's not just because he changed history in many ways, but because he wrote something that allows us to study the history, understand things that go far beyond, through the same military aspect. In fact, the same that can transcend it. at so many political, moral, and cultural levels. So, again, counterfactual how? Like, meaning if Vercingetorix Rex had pressed on him after Gergovia, and he would have been defeated, been destroyed, or at a leisure, whatever, because there are lots of different instances when he was about to risk everything, and this is incredibly accurate. Like the Romans, and there is the Fortuna Kaiseris, I made a video about that, literally had developed a theology of this. Like all Indo-European peoples actually had this. Through Caesar, we actually know that he's illustrating us also history of religions while describing the Gallic Wars. He's giving you the metaphysical premises for how to cope with Holy War, chasing the second Trinity, the second person of the Clausewitzian Trinity. Literally, they had an entire religion about this. There's a subset of the Catholic religion dedicated to Fortuna and the role of the victorious commander. That was, in many ways, what most of Roman religion really was about. Here, the author says, why did he travel to so and so region to do and so? I don't understand here what this really meant. There are a few typos. In any case, like, we know, like, if you study the Commentario del Bello Gallico, you actually get that. Like, he explains that to you, and it is very logical. And it's not like there weren't other options. This is something you can actually study very well. I have a video coming on Pharsalus, by the way, regarding the civil war as well, with Pompey. There is probably a Boyd cycle that at some point I will make a video on that Caesar used and that Pompey failed at. That illustrates that partly that approach. And again, like Boyd cycle is not like Caesar would have simply seen this, and we will never know how he would simply see that, as he only could in many ways. But we understand that the decision-making of it all was also quite almost granitically coherent, right? Because it's not much about what the person decides, but why they decide, and how much they nail reality to be more favorable on that ground. Provided that, again, it's not a deterministic, again, choice, but still, because all the steps of the way, and this is also why it doesn't make much sense to look at these counterfactuals, will tell you that every step of the way could theoretically go wrong. And we know that also traditionally, and in the theory of games and more, that, of course, even a minimal event, there are some beautiful medieval ballads that literally talk about this. What if, I don't know, a horseshoeing was made wrong? There is all the scale of how things will go wrong up to the king's army, like during a campaign, and this stemmed, obviously, whoever wrote that from it's literally like our modern scientific understanding that we need to make all this kind of dumb categorical descriptions of today to even think to be able to use, where these people simply use that because they were so habituated to actual reality that they didn't have any interest in going in any other direction, right? And so the question continues, and how would the campaign have been altered if he blundered and lost his particular important battle? Should we ignore asking these questions entirely and try to keep straight the events that actually happened? I would say the latter, but again, in the Grimoire section, I explained why, because, again, what if, like, because Caesar also, like anybody else there, was one step away from annihilation. Otherwise, those battles would not even really be won. Again, that it wouldn't make any sense to presume that. So let's assume you had an idea about why, say, what would have been the immediate aftermath of a specific defeat, even maybe a secondary one whereby Caesar was still standing, and let's assume we can't even calculate the ideally, because we don't know, it didn't happen, so we have no idea the actual losses of that. And even, again, those episodes in the Battle of Gallico that made you understand how close he went to defeat, which would have also taken him down with him at that point just by natural coherence of the Roman leadership. But, let's say, how do you know what everybody did later? Like, you don't have sources This is a very important historical point. You don't have further sources other than Caesar that told you how the scenario could have evolved in a complete fashion, or even a satisfactory one. Like, we don't know how many goals were here and there, how many moral forces were involved. If, we don't know what kind of, whether our commander was good or not, what decision he would have made. What's the point of even asking? We have what we have because it happened. What I would like to stress about the utmost privilege of studying history is that it tells you the history of what actually happened. Like, this entire problem, let's suppose this was transposed to a game, right? Like, you don't know this is a historical event, or you want to know how it went. Like, history tells us exactly how it went because it literally happened that way. And again, it's coherent. You can't say, but again, we don't even have through the source the actual picture of reality. You tell me. I specialize on battle reconstructions, and we have to look at different sources trying to make sense of what I say. It's extremely complicated, all right? But in this sense, there are also, for classical history, we have usually just one source, 2, 3, that is relevant to reconstruct the tactical development. If you are lacking in that way. So what's the point to elude that? Considering that you can always add sort of different pieces to the equation that frankly always makes sense. This is taken from, again, the actual experts in this field, and I made multiple videos on Schwerpunkt also demonstrating that, looking at, in fact, exactly those battles for which you can cover the sources. What you get from historical literature is shockingly accurate. All right, you don't have, I don't know, just not saying, dragons flying on the battlefield, kind of example, but I mean, certain things are blatantly exaggerated also because they turn out to be the exception, not the rule, and you can sort of sort it out for some cultural reasons. Like, I don't know, we've seen how often different cultures treat numbers in different ways, but there is a logical explanation. I mean, even that is plausible, speaking of why they would actually write this at the time, right? But all these battles that also, especially in Western historiography, we can more reasonably and critically evaluate thanks to the clear analysis already provided by the sources themselves, actually make a lot of sense. And yes, of course, it's plenty of, it's not the truth, 100%, whatever you may argue that, people like to debunk everything because they're iconoclasts and they hate civilization, etc. And so they want to pretend that certain battles were fictional because they don't like it. But even if they had been fictional, still, we know, historiographically speaking and historically speaking, that the description of that battle, regardless sometimes of any other evidence, is dramatically accurate for the type of warfare that we know of, like, quite consistent way that, again, the sources are incredibly adhering to without anybody telling them to. Again, accurate for the times art of war, all right? So I honestly really care about this because if you sort of concentrate on what ifs, you lose the best of it. Like, what you should love about what ifs is the actual answer provided by history. That's immediately, logically, what you're gonna get into. You literally have it. Do you realize it's real? It's there. It's precious. It tells you everything about it. You don't have to postulate, to speculate. It's literally how it is, and or at least the closest that you will ever have to actual reality that you'll ever know most of the time. So about the event. So again, I don't think it's interesting unless, again, you are, for example, I've read incredibly, there are some people are very good at writing what ifs, and I remember, I lost track of that guy, but he was a veritable genius. Maybe I saved something. This was many years ago. This guy was an absolute genius. He was, just like astrophysics kind of guy, doctor, all those kind of literal genius. And in fact, as a spin-off, he knew history like, by heart at every archaeological, historical level. And this guy could, as a divertissement, just write these what-ifs. And of course, there was a pattern to that. You understood how he operated, and it's not like he was predicting the future of any possible, again, event in that way. But let's say he was remaking history in incredibly detailed way, in ways that was fairly plausible. And again, there are sites that speculate on this stuff, but again, it remains pure speculation, because the moment in which you understand how much things can divert, in the very moment that you lose track with reality, because it starts becoming the same speculation, you have no ground to stand on in order to guess how it would have actually happened. Just to make an example that I made before about Hastings, all right? So Hastings is fantastic, because it's not just it's a beautiful battle, it's so historically crucial, etc., but also everybody knows about that, right? So with Hastings, you can say, what would have happened if Harold had won, all right? And the kind of implications, considering our knowledge of history, and say we can at that point not predict things, but getting into the probable. There are a few things you can make the point of, such as that, at least in the absence that you can't calculate whether that would have happened or not, of a further continental invasion, Anglo-Danish Britain, or at least Anglo-Danish England, let's put it this way, would have likely remained more isolated from continental developments. We know that up to that point belonged to a world that we can't see from later, but still, because we know it from history, that also maintained certain characteristics that were part of the previous system, etc. You can make this kind of cases, but what kind of king would have emerged? What kind of other battle would have been fought? And so just another one like Hastings itself, it could have changed everything, immediately tells you that it doesn't make any sense to even calculate this, a year after what happened with Hastings, right after Hastings. And so had even things gone differently. So where's the fun at that point? What kind of, how do you spend that as valuable information other than fantasy, for fantasy novels? Like, how do you actually make a historical point to predict things like, I don't know, who was born, who would have been born, who not, on the basis of which genes or whatever? It doesn't make any sense, right? It's just like thinking about all the successful scientists that died during World War One, right? It's not much that World War One could have gone different direction. Literally, you start taking into account anything along the way that happened in there, and man, everything could have changed historically speaking. It would have had a really not completely different reality, but a radically altered reality compared to, in fact, some things that we probably give for granted. In fact, actually, the more I studied history, and the more I realized how I actually used to play this game. There's a bit of what if. Actually, it's the same thing, right? Is looking back at my life, my own life, and saying, like, what if I had taken the other path? Let's assume I had, as I was saying before, follow other university paths. So also very reliable things, because you know your life in theory better than anybody else. And let's say you can, especially the younger you are, the more you say, well, okay, if I took this path or another, it would have become that or another. Really? Like, the older you get, the more you realize how unpredictable this is. And my guilty pleasure in that was a sort of superstition, a dark Dionysian superstition of saying, I could now manipulate, I could control my own future. I could, say, win the lottery or all kind of that stuff. But if you stop thinking about it, even the fact that you lived in that world and took a chance rather than another would have significantly altered a lot, right? Even the lottery, probably staying 1 week in the street, that lottery would have changed results, because the people, like the car that stopped to make you pass, or the person that talked with you or whatever, would have altered all a set of things that would have brought to that minimal difference that was required for that lottery even to go. So from there to pretend, okay, let's say one thing is, say, okay, I know that if I insist on something, I keep, say, studying this stuff, I would have become good at that. But let's say you're also sort of downplaying how important it was for you to have done, for example, something else instead of that to know today how important what you did instead really was. So it's actually a mental jerk off. It doesn't really lead anywhere in expendable terms. What we really should concentrate is on what you want to do in the moment and for the future. And of course, trying to predict the future in some ways, but already in that expendably suitable fashion. Just think about regional sort of strategic analysis does not go beyond 3-4 months, right? And it's just because we're habituated to a level of likelihood in this time in history, etc., that we say, okay, this is where I will bet my money. This is the stretch to which I will bet my money if I really have to for anything of any to make sense. 4 months, man. It's basically, if you start looking at generations of difference, what's even the point of trying to predict the future? I think that this what if things are deeply connected with reality, from alienation from reality, due to collapse of Western values and mostly specifically feministic, because it turns out that it's rather women that enjoy it, but it's the feminine side that makes you enjoy really tendentially fiction as opposed to reality. All right, and this politically may not be a coincidence, right, with what is happening today. So no, right, and this in fact matches also with the appallingly low historical knowledge that you find among the masses today. Why do people alienate? Why do people get into what ifs? Like, we are in the moment in history in which we could get all the information we want in the easiest, most accessible way, and we waste time for what ifs. Where people in the past wanted to sort out the truth, how things really went. This is a moral collapse. There is no other way you can factually describe it. Right. So yeah, my definition that this is a pretty, categorical answer. Like, yeah, there is a margin by which you can think how something could go, but even in the moment in which you can spend it other than fiction, it's minimal. And it's most of the times just by definition incomplete. Because there are different levels of analysis as well. And that's why there is, for example, a hierarchy in society. Like, some people just understand something as the work has already been done by others. What's the point, again, of using a strategic mastermind commanding army corps as a soldier? No, right? It's wasting an invaluable asset for something that has, the worth of millions of those soldiers. So again, it's this is my actual answer. And then the answer says, I do hope, the question says, I do hope that I was able to express my thoughts in a clear manner. Again, if there is anything you do not quite understand, then feel free to come back at me. Thank you for taking the time to read my email, and I wish you a good day. Kind regards and God bless. Well, thank you. So yeah, this is pretty much it. And I really needed a video about what ifs because I had never made them. Right, never really made them. And it turns out, actually, it's important to make it. It's crucial even to do so. And I don't think we can or we should simply act as if they were not important topics, because as you understand here, you can greatly learn from them in ways that direct you somewhere else. And I would say, you know what, at the end of the day, what ifs are? What ifs are our petty attempt to presume that we have some kind of control on reality. And so it feels emotionally attractive, right? If we can predict this, we can predict, I don't know, everything in my life, hopefully. It's just this fake sensation of security, of alleged security that you don't really cultivate in that way. But when you understand that the best and most rewarding thing is to actually embrace the unknown and grow into the struggle and to see even in what actually happened, how the thing went and what kind of qualities it took in order to go through that, your entire world changes completely for the better, right? This is literally a life advice at all the levels that you can imagine in that sense. And I think that what ifs in this sense are very interesting as a test, right, of where you are and why you think this thing. And if you struggle with that, you will also see how, in fact, useless the thing really is, and how instead learning history and how things went is really the only way that is going to show you much more than you would have ever believed it was possible to find out, right? And again, I could extend on this because this has life-like ramifications, meaning that if you that there are ways you could apply this, right, in very concrete ways, just in fact from figures. That's how the what if is actually useful, and not in the other way that random people tend to think like, because it's the cheaper, easier way to look at them. But indeed, on my channel, there is plenty of information, say, on how to play with this, and of how to you can obtain like that grasp of information. It's mostly in the battle analysis. There's a lot of that there. Also in this file, again, the Von Kriege series is mostly the most indicated, because it really solves these problems at the root, and von Clausewitz is an antidote to all this kind of thinking. That, again, is incredibly powerful, and it really advised to anyone who's really into the topic. And then, of course, you can really enter in, like, if you're passionate about these things. I made some videos, for example, about the criticism of war games. That, I think, is very important, because war games start a bit from the same presupposition. That is to say, basically, there is a finite dimension that you can simply contain within, in fact, some rules. And, of course, everybody there would tell you that there is some approximation, but there are people who are so much stuck into that world, very often without even actually having a real military historical literacy. We're not talking about education or competence, that they will start thinking that their system is how it would have actually gone in reality and how you can replicate it. That's a delusion, all right? The best way to do that, if you really want to know how things went, and having a clear, expandable, fluid, malleable, open-minded idea of how things would have actually gone, even in, say, in the immediate, or why they went the way they did, and not in another one, you must study history. You must especially habituate yourself to probably feel the burden of history, the burden of these dynamics. In other words, you can't start even measuring moral forces without mathematically quantifying them. That is really the sort of Zen level of the Clausewitzian strategical education, is really getting that there isn't such thing like a good historical analysis without taking into account things that are mostly matter of senses, right? If anything, we could make a video even about how these can be described, right? But if you, say, empirically, if you have the answer for basically how things went during the battle, and you can, of course, the only way you can is through the sources, through the actual evidence, then you're mastering that. You know what those forces are. You know why that battle went in a way rather than another. You can say, even if you don't have an idea of how this battle line was made up by, etc., you can understand it was fundamentally tough or weak, etc., basing on how combat went, as far as, again, limited evidence tells. But telling you some factorial aspects that are very eloquent about that. And that happens only through sheer practice. And method, again, reconstructing battle after battle after battle, in realizing again how this practically compares to other battles as well. Because there is that method of analogy as well. Here we're not using it because that is basically very close to yet another what if thing. Because it basically is used by people for normally as for approximation, just to say, since a historical event went that way, so this one will go this other one. Again, that's not how it works. But it's also more than that. It's a way, of course, to know that similar systems, of course, go similar ways. So if you have studied, especially many battles of the same period, right? Studying one battle can tell you a lot, right? It's the first time you do it through all the sources available, etc. It's really going to open your mind in a way you wouldn't believe. But then when you do with the second, the third, the fourth, etc., you're starting to notice that basically something you had written about the first, you sort of already emphasized because you had no clue that it was normal, or maybe you tended to generalize thinking it happens in every battle and it doesn't, and you understand why it happens now because you have so much more to compare it from, and of course there is a matter of likelihood as well that plays in history. So again, there are limits to this, and things can indeed this is basically the way we normally go also in our fields. In my opinion, the diachronic comparative analysis is everything. Like von Clausewitz basically studied history himself as a military historian in the same, not in the same way. And again, this is absolutely obvious as well. And this is what properly the art of war is about, right? It's not merely military history like one guy writing a book once about a battle. This is knowing your deal as an expert about properly how things change historically along that path. That's it, right? Very well. However, I was glad, of course, to answer this question, and they will keep arriving, and especially the bigger the channel becomes, and etc. I also can't quite answer everybody all the time. I have lots of these to cover, and I can't make this stuff too often. However, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel. If you're interested in my upcoming content, as always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.